Let's get back to Sarah Eisen in Washington, D.C. as we continue, Sarah, to monitor some of these headlines on the wires regarding Besant.
Absolutely, Carl. Joining me now is Ajay Banga, the World Bank president, former MasterCard CEO for more than a decade, which is how a lot of our audience knows you. Ajay, it's great to see you. Thank you for having us here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you again.
I mean, I mentioned that there's a whole different sense of urgency here with all the finance ministers coming. They're trying to make a deal with the Trump administration. I'm curious how this big trade fight impacts what you do.
Yeah, well, you know, trade at the end of the day, if you get volatility and uncertainty in trade, in markets, it makes things a little harder for people to make decisions, governments and the private sector. And for the developing world, which is my client base, what this will lead to is volatility in their growth predictability. It could impact them in different ways, in a positive way too. If interest rates go down or the dollar is weaker, remember their debt was denominated in dollars and euros, and their debt was denominated in interest rates that may go down. If all that happens, there's a plus and a minus here. But on trade specifically, there are 2 or 3 things I've been telling them. One is, think about what you could do with each other as well. That's really important. Bilateral and regional trade deals. Sarah, they've been on the rise for the last 10 years. This is not a new phenomenon. And trying to do more trade with each other is interesting because there's a statistic that says that while trade has quadrupled in 20 years across the world, and the developing world has gone from 1/5 of that to 2/5 of that, of that 2/5, half is between themselves. And so thinking that through carefully is a real opportunity. Look at Africa. If they were to increase the trade among themselves, you would get a 20 to 25% growth in their GDP over years.
This is what Europe said too. I mean, Christine Lagarde said the same thing, which is intra-Europe is so important.
It's an interesting opportunity.
But doesn't everyone need the U.S. ultimately?
Of course, it's the largest market in the world. And at the end of the day, there is a need to negotiate and work out a deal with the U.S. And I also advise this in my opening press conference. Talk to them, get it worked out, because it's important. The reality is, the developed world, the U.S. in particular, has had the lowest tariffs of any country for a long time. What you've got really, if you look at the economic data, if you bring tariffs down, you will get overall growth around the world. And the question is, how do you get that done in a way that's sensible for all the countries involved? And that's why I'm trying to thread the needle, say, while you're doing the negotiation, please do, and do it quick. But while you're doing it, please also try and work on what you could do bilaterally and regionally, because there is an opportunity there. There's a third thing. Use this to get your own house in order. Because, you know, when you have a challenge to deal with, you can get the political tailwind in your reform system, whether it is for domestic resource mobilization, whether it's for fiscal reform, whether it's managing your budgets, that kind of thing.
How do you think, you mentioned the uncertainty and how it's really damaging to developing economies for planning. How do you think about the economic fallout right now for the rest of the world?
Pretty much the same way. As I was talking about the debt, for example. Look, I think at the end of the day, if you continue with uncertainty, you will get a slowdown in growth, in global growth. And if you get that to happen, the developing world is going to have to think about how they manage through the growth that they need. You can't create jobs for young people without growth. And that's the critical area, why I'm so focused on
I know that's been your big
jobs.
thing, is jobs. Like billion young people entering the workforce. Will there be jobs?
So 1.2 billion in the emerging markets will enter the workforce in the coming 10 to 15 years. Currently, the same countries are forecasted to create 420 million jobs. Now, forecasts are not destiny, but you can change them. But you got to do something about it. That's a very big gap. And the reality is, what's the implication of that gap? One, of course, is migration, fragility, conflict, violence, illegal migration. Second is the whole challenge around the growth of what could be great consumer markets, not just for Western and OECD companies, but also local companies. And so I think getting to the topic of growth and jobs is important. People sometimes think that if you talk about jobs, you're not talking about development. Actually, that's a false choice. You can't get jobs without development, and you don't get poverty alleviation and development without jobs.
Which is your whole mission.
Yes.
In
I'm
terms
completely
of
on this.
bringing countries out of poverty. Just on the trade front, though, U.S.-China, we're monitoring these headlines that from the Journal that the U.S. might de-escalate with lower tariff rates. We're reporting that it would be part of some sort of negotiation. Last night, President Trump said it's going to be very nice. How do you process this? Because you're sort of stuck in the middle. The U.S. is the biggest and most important stakeholder in the World Bank, but China is also an increasingly important one.
Yeah, look, I'm not involved with that trade dispute. It isn't part of the World Bank's mandate or remit. I'm quite focused on it being in what we do, which is development. And China is already well advanced as a country. So that's neither of those two countries are places where I operate for operations. I operate there for fundraising, I operate for support, I operate for technical knowledge, that kind of thing. But I don't operate there for activity. So,
but when the US
outside my scene.
When the U.S. and China fight, you mentioned the fallout on developing world. Who gets hurt the most in your purview?
Well, in my purview, it's the developing world. But at the end of the day, nobody wins in a long-term fight. And I think that's kind of where everybody's trying to go. There are positions to be staked out, but there's eventually a negotiation to happen and a deal to be done if it makes sense for both. And, that's what I think everybody's trying to get to. The question is, from here to there is not an easy pathway.